What is up, Line Cook Nation? This is Ray DeLucci with the Line Cook Thoughts podcast. Hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. Welcome back to another episode of the show. Before we get into the show today, just a friendly reminder that every Monday I put out a newsletter called Prep List Items. This newsletter is information and other just ideas, gear, pieces of news, anything that I find interesting, I send to you every Monday in an email newsletter format. So go to linecookthoughts.com, enter your email, and hit subscribe at the top of the page to be signed up for the Prep List Items newsletter. Also, if you're listening on Apple, please leave a review, and Spotify, if you're listening as well, please leave a review. It helps me get better and lets me know what you want from the podcast. So today's podcast is a little bit different. I was on the Best Serve podcast by Best Serve Creative a few weeks ago, and Jensen Cummings, the host of that podcast, had me on to discuss some opportunities in the industry for cooks, for people in the food industry. And he interviews me, and it's about an 18-minute interview, and I wanted to share that content on the podcast today because I thought it was a great conversation with him. I really love Jensen's insights, and I also thought I really was able to chat with him and articulate a lot of interesting points regarding cooks within the industry itself. And a big thing we talk about is longevity and the idea of celebrity chef and the idea of villainizing a Food Network chef, but then we hold into regard celebrities in the Michelin space. And yet the probably outcome to getting to either is very slim, and why we hold one in high regard and not the other. But in terms of career paths, while both are easily very hard to get into, is something we talk about. Longevity of cooking is something we talk about. The idea that a lot of people in the industry don't think their skills can be transferred into other areas of the food industry is something we talk about. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I love what Jensen does over at his podcast, over at Best Serve Creative, and over at everything else he does. I'm putting links to everything in the show notes of this episode or the description of this episode. So go down and check it out. And please go check out Best Serve Creative. Check out Jensen's work, and obviously check out the Best Serve podcast. Jensen, thanks for letting me share this. Thank you all for listening, and here we go.
What's up, everybody? Jensen Cummings here. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. Today is Best Served Podcast 402, how restaurant workers can be high contributors to increase their self-worth and financial worth. You've been hearing me talk about high contributors a little bit more because of how much we glorify hard work, and I'm trying to understand how we can put in effort, put in time, put in care, but not grind ourselves to the bone that so many of us burn out, like myself. And I'm interested in this, especially because we come into the industry at such a young age so often that we don't understand how to pace ourselves through a career. Because how many 65-year-old line cooks do we know that are getting ready to retire with a pension and putting 2.1 kids through college, right? That American dream. Those things don't often exist for us. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to bring in Ray DeLucci of Line Cook Thoughts, somebody I've been following for quite a while. Twitter game strong, podcast great. So let's bring Ray in. No further ado. Ray, good to see you.
You too, man. Thanks for the kind words.
Hey, absolutely. I love that you're raw, you're real, you're pulling from your own experiences, you're challenging the powers that be, and even being myself an elder of this industry now 22 plus years, we didn't understand the responsibility that we had. We built this industry, and now we're blaming 22-year-old kids these days, with big air quotes, that somehow they're the problem. Wrong. We are the problem. They're the opportunity we have for improving our industry. And so I like that you're coming from that perspective. So give us a little background. I mentioned Line Cook Thoughts. You've been doing that for a few years. How long have you been in the industry? Just give us a little groundwork.
Yeah, so I've been in the industry for 10 years. I got it when I was 15. I'm 25 now. I've been doing Line Cook Thoughts for a little over 4 years. So podcast, writing, Instagram, all the fun things that come with food media. And yeah, I've had experience working in fine dining. I've managed restaurants in a restaurant group. Post-COVID, I've done research and development, food manufacturing, some time with online grocery. So a little bit here and there, do some food writing on the side. And so yeah, it's just been really fun last 10 years, a lot of different routes with the pandemic and, the how tough things are generally in the food industry, not just restaurants. You'd be surprised how tough all food businesses have it at all times. But yeah, it's been a really fun time. And obviously Line Cook Thoughts has been a highlight for me. So that's kind of been the past 10 years since I've got in.
Yeah, it is a struggle to commit yourself to the food, beverage, hospitality industry. It gives so much, takes so much. It's such a love-hate relationship for sure. So when you're thinking about this idea. And real quick, because I just remembered, I always think back to first jobs. Yours was at Wendy's. And
Mm-hmm.
I love that fast food has been an entry point for so many people. You know, I think a lot of us chefs scoff at fast food, like we're above that. We're at this fine dining level. It creates an entry point, and it created an entry point for you. So as always, everyone, bestservedpodcast.com. Check out 6 Questions with Ray DeLucci. You got a couple nuggets in there, some good advice as well. And as always, what's in the pantry, which is great. I'm not even going to tell people. They got to go check it out. That's for you. Line cook thoughts, right? When you're thinking about how you're trying to communicate when you are a line cook yourself, and kind of for people that are at that level that are looking to ascend and excel in this industry, how can we start to get rid of maybe that work until you pass out on the line type mentality, while still kind of having a trajectory that allows us to excel through pay increases, promotions, our own personal development? Give us a high level thinking there.
Yeah, I think, as you know, when I started Line Cook Thoughts, obviously it's in the name. I was a line cook, and since then I've gone on to manage restaurants, and like I said, get into like food manufacturing and food development. And I've always, I think there's a part of me that struggled leaving the kitchens for a long time. I think
Sure.
even after leaving restaurants, I felt very much like that imposter syndrome effect. And I think the easy route, but the dishonest route, would have been to just continue acting as if I was a line cook and really been focused on, I think, the stuff that really gets a lot of people's attention, like fine dining and cool plates and everything else. But I really wanted to take the page in the brand into a different space as I was kind of evolving. And that involves this idea that I've talked about a couple times, where the restaurant industry is often seen as this separate thing. It's often like, it's like the restaurant industry is like the outcast. It's where like everyone goes that don't really belong in society. And I think that's such a detrimental viewpoint. I think there's something special to be said for people who work in restaurants and people who work in food. Obviously, the job isn't like everywhere else. There's a lot of different things about it. But I think when we treat the restaurant industry and the food industry as if we're outlaws, and that as if we're special and above like normal societal standards, then that we also make excuses for ourselves to not treat people well, to not have good schedules, not have good work-life balance, not have good pay, to not have good benefits. And so I think there's a detriment almost in this idea of the outlaw cook or the outlaw chef, and like viewing our industry as that, because in the long run, I really do think it affects how we look at our industry and how we look at labor in the industry.
Ray, I just had to talk about this recently, and one of the books that got me on this path was Kitchen Confidential, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about that, the outcasts, the rebels, the misfits, and the pirates that Bourdain talks about. And I had to say, like, that book is true. It still inspires me, and it's fucking toxic as hell too.
Mm-hmm.
It glorified so many of the worst parts of us as individuals, as teams, as a business model. So yeah, I'm with you 100%. And I'm pushing back against the hard work model. Like, that's wild. The hardest worker. I'm like Mamba mentality. I'm the first one in, the last one out. I went almost 7 years without taking a sick day. I thought that's what you were supposed to do, because we're so young when we get in the industry. Quite often, we don't have the leadership skills. We don't have the communication skills. We don't have that self-worth quite often. And so only what we put on the plate is a representation of, are we good enough to contribute? So I appreciate you pointing that out. You also had some like really practical things when we've interacted, and you specifically mentioned somebody that was kind of in your orbit that had a very different trajectory and a very different expectation. So even people that kind of come into the industry in a similar place at a similar time, that mindset is different. And
Mm-hmm.
some of us, excel and move up quickly, and others get kind of stagnant. So touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to actually talk about that example, but when we were speaking before the podcast, I actually remembered someone else that stuck with me for a while.
Tell
And
me,
this is
tell
when
me,
I
hit me.
was this is when I was staging in Chicago in the end of 2018, and I was looking to work in Michelin restaurants, and I quickly realized that I would never be able to afford to live in a Chicago or New York and work in Michelin due to student loans, car loans, living on my own, rent, all those different things. I remember I met this cook. I promise I can talk. I met this cook, and he was there, and I was like, oh, how are you doing? Like, and he seemed a little bit like older in age. It turns out he was like 42. And I was like, oh, so like, what are your goals? What are your aspirations? And he was just like, yeah, I'm just a line cook. And I was like, okay. And he was like, And I was like, what are your plans for the future? Like, what about like as you hit 50? And he's like, honestly, like I don't know that I'd ever be good at anything more than line cooking. And he had gotten to the industry and he was like 18. And so what success was to him was to go stage at the best restaurants around the countries. And I thought for a while that was pretty cool. I was like, he's just dedicating himself to the craft. But then I thought about it a little bit further. And I realized in like a decade, he will not be able to keep up at the pace that he was going there. It was a very high intense restaurant in Chicago. I could tell he was kind of already like slowing down. And he had for what I know and how he explained to me, there was nothing saved. There's no path for when he was done cooking. And it was just kind of like this, resistance to ever thinking he could be a leader. And I said, well, you have all this experience. Why don't you try to go for sous chef? And he was just kind of like, no one's ever really like given me that opportunity. And I don't know that I've ever, and he's like, and he kind of looked at chefs as like this thing to worship or these entities to worship. And as if they would come down from like their heavenly clouds and like tell him when he was going to be a sous chef
and anoint them. That's a big problem. I think about the, Noma's announcement, and all of a sudden Noma says, wait, we have a really shitty business model. Why? Because we're going to have to incur $50,000 more a month to pay interns who spend 16 hours a day making fruit leather beetles that maybe it isn't actually the escalator to success that we deemed it to be. And so I believe it, right? We're young, impressionable, and we stay in that adolescent mindset. And so this cook at 40, 42 doesn't surprise me at all, because we think that if we just get close to those anointed chefs, by osmosis, somehow our careers will accelerate. And that's just not true. Is that what you find?
Oh, it's not true. And I think the chefs that really make it are rare. I think that there's an issue with cooks going into the industry that if you were to actually look at it, and this is all conversations that many aren't having, because again, we see ourselves as outlaws in the restaurant industry. But when you look at a cook's trajectory, like it's line cook to maybe head of a station to maybe a sous chef, an exec chef in a restaurant. And for some people, that's a goal. And like, that's a good goal to have, and that's a good goal. If you're passionate about it, you should go for it. But then what's past that? And like, you can be a chef like for the rest of your career, but there's no really movement past that. And can only be one chef in a restaurant. And there can only be a few spots where you have these mega star chefs. And of course, it's great when they become successful. And I don't ever like look down on anyone's success, or I don't ever like if someone's successful in food, I don't ever like judge them that they've become successful. But what I'm trying to say is I think that their career path everyone is subscribed to, but so rarely that is actually the outcome. Yeah. And so it's like, what is a realistic career path for someone in the food industry? And does that mean staying in restaurants their entire time? And does that mean not trying other things like elsewhere? So that's kind of what I've seen.
Yeah, this Food Network effect over the last 22, 25 years has really shown us a singular path that we're like, okay, I want to be the chef owner of a restaurant. We don't even know what that means, let alone all the other opportunities. And you mentioned the imposter syndrome. I struggle with that too. Like, if I'm not the hot shit chef, rising star chef, who am I? And again, we just don't have the capacity for that understanding, that leadership, that communication, and that self-worth. And so I'm very interested in how we build new business models that do allow for a 65-year-old line cook to be able to do that for an entirety of a career, if that's the path that they choose. But that's not built for that, right? If you look at the numbers, our industry, 30% of our industry, a third of our industry is under 21. Another third is under 30. That means from 30 to retirement, there's only a third of the entirety of our industry that's at that age set. You age out very quickly in this industry. That is not a sustainable business model. So how do we create a trajectory within the business model that serves the individuals and the business, but allows for some longevity? Like 10 years in the industry, I mean, it's like a running back in the NFL. You're basically have to be ready to retire. Well, we haven't made any money like an NFL running back to be able to retire. So what are your thoughts there?
It's a good point. I think I want to go back to something you just said about the Food Network effect. And I would equate Michelin as the same as that. Yeah, and I know some people listening are going to be like, oh my gosh, like, what are you saying?
Michelin people are giving their Michelin stars back. They're like, this is bullshit pressure for the sake of what?
It's pressure, but it's also like, you look at Michelin chefs, okay, maybe they cook food in a way that, and maybe it's, some would say it's more pure food. I would say it's using a lot of cheap labor for a lot of them, aka Noma, for the last however many years.
Yep.
But what is Rene Redzepi doing that's also different than a Bobby Flay? And I know that sounds crazy, and I know, and obviously the food and the integrity is different. And of course, I would rather eat at Noma than anything that Bobby Flay is doing.
I'm with you though.
But Rene's not. I mean, he's working on menu items, but he also has to be a spokesperson, and he's also a celebrity, and he's also on shows, and he also has a brand, and he also has all these different things. Like, his trajectory is becoming a celebrity chef. Like, that's where he's finding financial success. And so I say that to say that, like, a lot of people always knock like the Food Network, or say that use the Food Network while also praising celebrity chefs and Michelin, and it's like it's all the same to me.
We're such a contradiction.
Food. Yeah, it's like they're so far apart, but they're all doing the same thing of marketing and media, and of course, like integrity and different things like that come into play. But if you really break it down, not everyone's going to be a celebrity chef. So going back to your question, I think when you look at food industry people, it can't just be always only restaurants. I think there's so much out there in food, and I think that's where things need to, like, if you want to do like restaurants and own your own restaurant, that's great. But I think and I've talked to a lot of people, I know people in my community that are tired of working in restaurants, but don't see themselves as valuable workers anywhere else. And that's just not true. And it's part of the industry telling them that they're not valuable anywhere else. And it's part of just their own perceptions and their own lack of trying new things. So, I mean, I think it's like those two things together. So, and then this overarching, like with the celebrity chef trap morphs into different things. 90s, it was Food Network. Now it's Michelin and San Pellegrino. What's next? I don't know. But it's like, that is as unattainable as Food Network, in my opinion.
And you mentioned something earlier on that, the cook couldn't do anything else, couldn't be good at anything else. I think the pandemic also showed that a lot of restaurant skills are highly transferable into and sought after into lots of other industries. Lots of other industries are trying to figure out how to be the hospitality industry of theirs, because the relationships that we create are unique and dynamic in a way that other businesses aren't able to foster. And so they're very transferable. But to your point, restaurants are monolithic, let alone the food industry being monolithic, and then our skill set not being transferable allow this very narrow tightrope for us to walk. And very few of us can actually accomplish that. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you highlighting this. And again, this is some of what's in this article. Everybody go to bestservedpodcast.com, 6 questions with Ray DeLucci. You get into some of this stuff. Again, I appreciate this. Like, we have to challenge our preconceived notions. We have to challenge this mystique that we've created around this industry, because that facade it's crumbling right now. We need to build something different. So Ray, I appreciate you being at the forefront of that. Keep working on that. Don't let any of us off the hook for having built this. We got to do better. We got to leave it better than we found it, my friend.
No, I totally agree. And I feel the same way for me. Like, I always love feedback. Like, every podcast I put out, give me feedback. Anything I say here, like, give me feedback. I just think I see things now where it's like, I hate like pedestals. And I hate that some pedestals are deemed bad by chefs and some pedestals are deemed good. Well, a lot of pedestals that we look up to actively contribute to people not having great work-life balance, or actively don't pay them. And like, so for me, like, going back to that example I just shared, I know a lot of people might feel off about that, but if you really think about it, like, why are we promoting a style of cooking that makes people not paid well, or that doesn't offer them health insurance, or that isn't sustainable for, like, that doesn't make sense to me. So
yeah, I
don't know.
Could not agree more. That hierarchy triangle needs to get flipped upside down. The pedestal needs to be the dishwashers, the line cooks, the bussers, the servers, the hosts. I 100% agree with that, and I think it's important. And we're going to be talking later this week, as this is part of a Restaurant Week series, right? This is episode 3 of 7 this week that we're going through. We're going to talk about awards. We're literally going to talk about awards, because I want to see a change. Like, I want to see average pay and average employee tenure as one of the criteria for an awards, a James Beard Award, a Michelin star, or an icon on Yelp, so that we can start on more information than just what goes on the plate. So I appreciate you pushing that, and I know how important that is. So, man, thanks for being on. This was a great conversation. Get out of here. Thank you so much, Ray. All right, everyone, that is it for this episode. Once again, this was Best Served Podcast 402. 2, how restaurant workers can be high contributors to increase their self-worth and financial worth. It's complicated. It is absolutely necessary and long overdue. So thanks to Ray for breaking it down. And as always, I appreciate he's challenging us. We need it. We can't keep buying into the same old narrative. All right. Appreciate it.
So there you have the interview that was done by Jensen Cummings on me for his podcast. Go check it out. I put the link to his podcast and his site in the description below. Thank you, Jensen, so much for interviewing me and having me on your show and letting me share this audio and video. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you on the next Line Cook Thoughts podcast.